Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
At my mother's 50th anniversary dinner, the wine was expensive, the dresses were tasteful, and the tension you could have sliced with a goddamn dessert spoon. The waitstaff hovered like ghosts, top buttons tight, refilling champagne flutes before they were halfway empty. Candlelight danced across crystal and porcelain, but underneath all that glittering civility, something was rotting. And everyone at that long table, cousins, in-laws, lifelong friends, even my brother David, felt it. They didn't say it, of course. We're Southerners. We smile through rot. We bless hearts while holding grudges sharp enough to kill. Elaine, my mother, sat at the head of the table, draped in seafoam silk and enough jewelry to bankrupt a modest family of 4. Her third facelift had finally settled. Her skin looked like polished wax, and her lipstick was a deep plum, the kind of color you wear when you want to look dangerous. She raised her glass with theatrical precision, her fingers trembling just enough to look elegant, not frail. "To 50 years with my darling Richard," she purred, her voice smooth but firm, like a sermon dressed up as a compliment. Everyone clapped, because of course they did. Then she paused, glass still aloft, and turned her head slightly in my direction. "Angelina," she said, drawing out my name like it tasted foreign. "Who is no longer part of the will." There was an audible gasp. A fork hit a plate. Someone coughed into their napkin. My cousin Alyssa reached for her husband's hand under the table like we were watching a plane crash in real time. The silence that followed stretched on just a second too long, which made it perfect. My mother always knew how to make a scene land. She had impeccable timing on stage, at the pulpit, and especially when driving a knife into your ribs with a smile. But me? I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just looked up from my untouched dessert, met her gaze, and said, calm as a Sunday afternoon, "That's fine. Your will doesn't matter anymore, because," and then I took a slow sip of my wine. "Let it hang. Let the curiosity claw its way into every brain at that table like mold creeping under paint." I didn't give them the end of that sentence. I didn't need to. They'd fill it in themselves. That's the thing about this family. They're better at guessing than asking. My mother gave a little shrug and sat back like she'd just ordered salmon instead of chicken, like this wasn't the public disowning of her only daughter. David shifted in his seat across from me, already uncomfortable in his too tight tux. He'd always hated these dinners. But he loved the benefits, his mortgage paid, his kids' tuition covered, all with the swipe of Mom's signature. He wasn't about to bite the hand that bought his lake house. I didn't expect him to. I looked around at the faces. All those polite people, pretending to be shocked, pretending to be confused. They weren't confused. They knew this was a long time coming. I'd been the black sheep since high school, since I said I didn't want to go to church anymore, since I dropped out of pre-law to become a nurse. A nurse, for God's sake. That's a job for Mexicans, my mother had said once, drunk on gin and entitlement. That was the real crime, in her mind, not the job itself, but the insult it represented. That I had chosen service over status. It didn't hurt. Not anymore. Because I had stopped bleeding over that woman years ago. You don't mourn someone who was never really your mother. You mourn the idea of them. And I buried that idea the same year I buried my dad. You know what's funny, though? She had been married to my dad for 45 years, which is wild because I'm 44. So, unless they were celebrating early, someone's math or morals were off. I always suspected I was a shotgun solution in a velvet-draped family, but seeing her toast to 50 years of devotion really hammered it home. Nobody corrected her, of course. You don't correct Elaine. You just smile and sip. I could see people trying not to look at me. Trying not to let their faces betray how juicy this moment really was. Hell, Alyssa's husband was already drafting a text under the table, probably to his sister, or a group chat called Family Drama, no Lena. They wouldn't say anything to my face. Not here. Not tonight. But the second the valet handed them their car keys, Oh, the whispers would fly like bats at dusk. I stood up quietly and adjusted my napkin on the table like I was some kind of lady, which, let's be honest, I never really learned how to be. I leaned in just enough so my voice didn't have to rise. I'm happy for you, Mom. 50 years. That's a long time to keep up a performance. I hope the encore's worth it. Her smile twitched. Just slightly. A glitch in the perfect programming. I turned and walked toward the bathroom. Not because I had to go, but because I wanted to give them time to marinate in it. Give them space to guess what the hell I meant. They'd think I was bluffing. Or losing it. Or both. They'd be wrong on both counts. Because I wasn't bluffing. And I wasn't crazy. I was ready. Let me tell you what really happened. Starting the day my dad died. When I was a kid growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, I learned two things before I ever learned how to tie my shoes. First, you don't cry in public unless it's for attention, and second, the truth doesn't matter nearly as much as how it looks. That second one was my mother's favorite lesson, a phrase she never said out loud, but lived like a damn religion. Elaine taught me that as long as your dress was pressed, your hair was brushed, and your teeth were white, nobody cared what was happening inside your house or inside your head. Our house sat at the end of a clean, curved cul-de-sac lined with azaleas and $500,000 homes that all looked just different enough to avoid suspicion. My father, Richard, was a CPA, quiet and decent, a man who always made sure to look you in the eye when he spoke. But his presence in our home was more of a guest star than a regular cast member. He worked too much and argued too little, which is probably why my mother ran that house like a queen with no king, her crown polished with approval from country club friends and church ladies in pastel suits. David was the golden child, born 3 years before me and practically baptized in praise. He had thick blonde hair, a dimple on one cheek, and a smile that could stop grown women in the middle of a grocery store aisle. My mother worshipped that boy like he was made of gold leaf and spun sugar. Every photo in our house had David front and center, beaming like a goddamn toothpaste commercial. If I was in the picture at all, I was off to the side, mid-blink or slightly out of focus. That pretty much sums up my whole childhood, present, but not seen. From the beginning, I was the quiet one, the reader, the kid who didn't scream for attention, because I knew it wouldn't make a difference. If David brought home a B, it was what a tough teacher. If I brought home an A, it was don't be a show-off. If I won a writing contest, my mother told people I spent too much time with my nose in a book. If David missed a practice, it was because he's under a lot of pressure. When I missed one, lazy, and yet I still tried. I tried so hard, because some part of me thought if I was perfect enough, good enough, useful enough, maybe she'd finally see me. But she didn't. Not really. I wasn't the child she could parade around. I wasn't cute in the right way. I wasn't bubbly or charismatic or eager to perform like David was. I was practical, too blunt, and too smart in a way that made people uncomfortable. So I leaned into that. I got my nursing degree by 24, moved out by 25, and stopped coming home for the holidays by 26. I learned how to patch up gunshot wounds and comfort dying grandmothers, how to work double shifts and sleep 4 hours a night, how to keep moving because sitting still made the silence too loud. Then, when I was 31, my father died of a sudden heart attack in his office. No signs, no warnings. 1 minute he was crunching numbers, the next minute he was slumped over his keyboard with the screen flashing error messages. I got the call at 3 in the morning from some stone-voiced nurse I didn't know, and by the time I got to the hospital, my mother was already there, perfect hair, dry eyes, clutching her handbag like it was a weapon. She barely looked at me when I arrived. Just nodded, then said, "We need to start thinking about the service." The funeral was tasteful, of course. White lilies, navy suits, closed casket. My father's clients showed up in droves, murmuring nice things and awkward condolences, most of which sounded like they'd been copied off a sympathy card. David gave a eulogy that sounded like it had been written by ChatGPT on Valium, all cliches and forced emotion. I didn't speak. My mother didn't ask me to, and I didn't volunteer. I just sat in the second row, hands clenched in my lap, watching the woman who had spent 30 years married to a man she never once really loved pretend to be devastated. But it was after the service that things started to feel off. The will was read a week later, and that's when the curtain dropped. Suddenly, Elaine had power of attorney. The estate was consolidated. Funds were restructured. Every question I asked was met with a vague answer or a cold stare. "Don't concern yourself with that, Lena," she said, more than once. "It's being handled." Handled by who? David? A lawyer I'd never met? Every time I pressed for information, I got less in return. And then, just like that, everything went quiet. No more meetings. No more paperwork. No more mentions of the trust or my father's intentions. She moved on fast, unnervingly fast, and anyone who pointed that out got the same look she used to give me when I asked too many questions as a kid, tight-lipped, chin raised, eyes full of pity and warning. But here's the thing she didn't count on. My father didn't leave quietly. Not entirely. He left something behind. Something important. Something she didn't know I'd find. And once I did, I knew I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I had every piece of the puzzle in my hand. Not until the moment was right. So I waited. And I watched. Because you don't walk into battle half-armed, not when your enemy gave birth to you. A week after the funeral, when the flowers had browned around the edges and the casseroles had started to smell faintly of guilt and sour cream, I found myself back in my father's home office. The place where he'd spent the better part of 4 decades bent over spreadsheets, tax returns, and the private finances of families who trusted him more than most of them trusted their own blood. The room was quiet, sterile in a way that felt sacred, like the kind of silence that makes you lower your voice without knowing why. Everything in there still smelled like him: coffee, old paper, aftershave, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something like grief bubble up past the wall I'd built to keep myself functioning. I didn't go in there with a plan. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just some kind of connection, maybe a letter, maybe an old photo tucked behind a book, anything that would make me feel like I hadn't imagined the moments of warmth we used to share when my mother wasn't looking. But what I found was smaller, more mechanical, and infinitely more important. The key was taped under the top drawer of his desk, the one that used to hold extra calculator batteries and sugar packets he swiped from diners during tax season. A small silver key, old enough to be worn smooth around the edges, labeled only with 3 numbers etched faintly into its side. I held it in my palm and stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of something I couldn't name yet. It took me 2 days to figure out where it belonged. A few quiet phone calls, a trip to the bank where he'd opened accounts for half the neighborhood, and a few awkward pauses from a clerk who clearly hadn't expected me to walk in wearing scrubs and a ponytail. Eventually, after some signature comparisons and a phone call to someone in legal, they led me to the vault. The safety deposit box was heavier than I expected, longer than a loaf of bread, and lined with a red velvet that felt strangely theatrical. Inside were 3 items. First, a thick stack of letters tied together with blue ribbon, handwritten in my father's looping cursive. Second, a folder marked Elaine, personal records, which I didn't open just yet. And third, a legal-sized envelope stamped with a notary seal, dated 3 years before his death. I opened the envelope last, not because I wasn't curious, but because I knew once I saw what was inside, something would shift in me forever. And I was right. It was a will. A different will. Not the one my mother had presented to the family attorney with crocodile tears and a fresh manicure. This one was brief, clear, and unflinching. It left everything, every account, every asset, every piece of real estate and stock portfolio to me. Not to the children, not to my loving wife Elaine, but to Lena Grace Whitmore, my daughter. Tucked into the envelope was a single note, just a few lines long. "You're the only one strong enough to undo what she's built. I'm sorry for not doing it sooner." I stared at that sentence until the words started to blur, my hands shaking just enough to make the letters dance. My father had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. He had seen the manipulation, the control, the subtle way Elaine had crushed my voice under the weight of family image and genteel expectations. And instead of confronting it, he'd left me the tools to dismantle it on my own. But I didn't use the will. Not yet. That would have been too easy, too fast. And besides, if I walked in with this document the week after the funeral, waving it like a sword, she'd find a way to twist it. Elaine was a master at flipping the narrative. She'd turn me into the bitter daughter, the selfish nurse with a chip on her shoulder, the spinster who couldn't stand to see her brother inherit the life she never wanted to earn. No, this had to be done right. Quietly. Slowly. From the inside out. So I started watching her. Not the way a daughter watches a mother, but the way a hunter watches prey. I listened to her conversations, paid attention to her spending, her mood swings, her moments of forgetfulness. I noticed how she got names wrong more often, how she repeated stories from 10 years ago like they'd happened last week. I started talking to her friends, the ones who still had sharp minds behind their bejeweled sunglasses. I took notes. I asked questions. I smiled a lot. And in the background, I went digging. The letters in the deposit box told me more than I ever expected about her past, her lies, the real reason she married my father. But the biggest surprise came from a different direction entirely, a line in one of the letters that mentioned a trust fund set up by my grandfather in the 1970s, one my mother had quietly absorbed after he died. It was supposed to be for the benefit of descendants, with no singular beneficiary allowed to exhaust the principal, but somehow she'd convinced the bank to let her act as sole trustee, probably using charm, intimidation, or forged paperwork. Maybe all three. That trust had clauses. Old ones. Binding ones. Ones she clearly thought nobody would ever read. So I started reading. And then I started calling lawyers. Not the flashy downtown ones she used, but the kind of quiet, paper-heavy firms that specialize in estate law and generational asset protections. The ones who don't advertise. The ones who answer the phone in half sentences and charge by the quarter hour. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about the power she held over everyone, over David, over our family name, and especially over me. That stranglehold had kept me silent for years. But now I had a pry bar. And I wasn't afraid to use it. The game wasn't about money. It was about control. And I was done playing by her rules. It started with one lunch, nothing formal, just a casual suggestion dropped over the phone by a friend of a friend, a favor from someone who remembered my father fondly. And within 3 weeks I found myself sitting across from Tom Belgrave in the lounge of a golf club neither of us belonged to. He wasn't what I expected. No pinstripe suit or slicked back hair, no fake laugh or gold watch. Just khakis, crow's feet, and a slow, deliberate way of speaking that made you lean in a little just to hear the whole sentence. That first meeting wasn't about anything specific. I told him I was just trying to get my mother's affairs in order, which wasn't a lie, not exactly, but it sure as hell wasn't the whole truth either. Over the next few months, I made a point to see Tom regularly, sometimes for lunch, sometimes for coffee, always under the guise of concern and daughterly obligation. I told him small things at first. How Mom had been repeating herself more lately, how she'd called my brother Frank twice in the same phone call, even though we haven't had a Frank in the family since 1987. I mentioned the missed bill payments, the forgotten appointments, the strange withdrawals from accounts she swore she didn't touch. I didn't accuse her of anything. I simply observed, documented. Let the weight of the facts speak louder than emotion ever could. Tom listened. He didn't rush. He didn't jump to conclusions. But he kept taking notes. And each time I left one of those meetings, I sent myself an email from a burner account I created just for this, to log the date, the conversation, and whatever documentation I'd brought with me. I wasn't just making a case. I was building a wall, one brick at a time, one that no one could knock over without a damn good reason. Meanwhile, I kept things calm on the surface. I smiled during brunches. I sent birthday cards. I took her to doctor's appointments and let her scold me in public about my hair or my shoes or how I never did learn to sit like a lady. I played my role. The good daughter. The helper. The caregiver. It was a role she'd never cast me in before, and now that I'd taken it on voluntarily, she accepted it without question, almost like it made her feel vindicated, like she'd been right about me all along. But privately, I was watching everything. The misplaced keys. The spoiled food. The way she started writing checks to the same gardener 3 times in 1 week. I recorded conversations. I saved voicemails. I followed the trail of money as best I could, and when things didn't add up, I added them up anyway, made note of the difference, and passed that information along carefully, quietly, to the people who mattered. The bank. The financial advisor. The legal contacts my father once trusted. I wasn't loud about it. I didn't need to be. And then came the opportunity. One night, after too much wine and a long, loud phone call to a friend she barely remembered the next day, Elaine handed me a stack of papers and told me to just take care of it. I sat at her kitchen table, her signature scrawled across 3 forms she hadn't read, sipping decaf while the cat licked butter from the countertop. One of those forms buried deep, surrounded by travel insurance paperwork and a routine check authorization, was a durable power of attorney, drafted 6 months earlier with Tom's quiet assistance and just enough ambiguity to pass beneath her radar. By the time she realized what she'd done, it would be far too late to take it back. To everyone else, I was just helping out. The dutiful daughter who finally came home, who finally stepped up, who took on the burden no one else wanted. David was grateful at first. He hated dealing with her paperwork, hated the long phone calls, hated how she always talked to him like he was 7 years old with jelly on his chin. As long as I didn't ask questions about his expenses or his irregular withdrawals from the joint account, he was happy to let me handle everything. And the truth is, Elaine was content too, for a while. She liked the control she thought she still had. She still made speeches at church luncheons. She still hosted bridge night like she was the queen of Charleston society. But the cracks were getting harder to hide. She forgot names. She repeated herself in front of people who noticed. And when the bank called to question a series of erratic account movements, it wasn't me they blamed. It was her. By the time I showed Tom the original will, the real one, the one from the vault, he didn't even flinch. He read it. He asked 3 questions. Then he nodded and slid it into a folder without comment. He knew what it meant. And more importantly, he knew why I wasn't using it yet. Timing. This wasn't about throwing a bomb into the middle of a Sunday dinner. It was about cutting the power, locking the doors, and waiting until the lights went out before striking the match. The trust fund was the final piece. I had confirmed it was still active, still under a framework that technically gave Elaine control, but now, due to her documented cognitive decline, would be legally subject to external oversight. I filed paperwork. I answered questions. I waited for the system to work, 1 gear at a time, until the entire machine began to turn in my direction. So when she raised that glass tonight, all smug and sweet and venom-laced, pretending it was her stage and I was just some background extra in the drama of her own life, I didn't flinch. Because I knew what she didn't. I knew that power was already shifting. That every person at that table who once feared her was about to see the truth. And I knew that the real show hadn't even started. Not yet. I didn't stand right away, because that's not how you finish something this big. Not when it's taken a decade to set the trap and half a lifetime to survive the wounds that made it necessary in the first place. I let the silence sit for another moment, thick, sour, clinging to the corners of the room like spilled wine in the carpet, while I laid my napkin gently on the table and took one final sip of my glass. Then I stood. Not fast, not slow, just steady, like I was answering a question no one had dared to ask. My mother was still holding her flute of champagne, her mouth half open in that smug little curl she always wore when she thought she'd won. Her eyes sparkled like she'd just checkmated me in front of a live audience, and in a way, she believed she had. That's the thing about people like Elaine, they confuse control with power and attention with love, and they don't even realize when the game has moved on without them. I clinked the side of my fork against my water glass, 3 sharp taps, not loud, but piercing enough to command the room's focus. Every conversation died instantly. Every eye turned toward me. Even the waitstaff froze at their stations, sensing something just off-kilter enough to register as dangerous. I didn't look at my mother. Not yet. I looked at the whole room, every cousin, every spouse, every lifelong friend who had watched me disappear over the years without once asking why, and I let them sit in their own silence for a beat before I spoke. "I understand, Mom," I said, my voice calm and steady, almost soft, like I was reading bedtime instructions. "But your will doesn't matter anymore, because legally, it's not yours to give." The words dropped into the center of the table like a grenade without a pin, and for one long, stretching second, no one moved. I watched it hit her then, not all at once, but like cold water seeping under the door. First her lips parted slightly, then her fingers tightened around the stem of the flute, and finally, she blinked twice, fast, the way someone does when they're trying to rewind time in their head and can't find the remote. I continued before she could interrupt, before anyone could try to salvage the moment with pleasantries or nervous laughter. "The will Dad left behind," I said, "the one he placed in a sealed envelope, notarized and filed properly in a safety deposit box only I had the key to? That's the one the bank recognizes. That's the one the trust was built on. And that trust," I added, letting my gaze flick toward the attorney seated 2 seats down, "has specific conditions, most of which you've already violated, and one of which requires the trustee to be deemed legally competent." That last word landed hard. I saw it ripple across the table like a slap across crystal. Elaine finally spoke, but her voice cracked just slightly at the edge. "Lena, what are you doing?" I turned toward her now, fully, letting her see the years of quiet calculation behind my eyes. "You were evaluated last week," I said simply, "by someone you thought was a home nurse." I glanced at David, who had gone pale, his fork frozen midair like he was trying to stop time. "I didn't want it to come to this. But you made it inevitable." David opened his mouth then, as if he was about to defend her, about to spout some pre-scripted line about stress or grief or manipulation, but I cut him off with a tilt of my head. The bank was already asking questions. I gave them the receipts. They gave me the documents. It's done. And just like that, the room began to shift. The energy changed. People started looking at each other, unsure of how to respond, caught between loyalty and self-preservation, between tradition and truth. Elaine sat straighter in her chair, but her hands were trembling now, the edges of her perfectly manicured nails pressing into her palm. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, just one. I placed it on the table in front of her. "That's the deed to the house," I said. "Already signed, already filed. I'll give you a few days to move out." For the first time in my life, my mother didn't have a comeback. She didn't scoff or sneer or scold. She just stared. And in that stare, I saw something I had never seen in her before. Not rage, not disgust, not even hatred. Fear. It was small, buried deep beneath years of performance and posture, but it was there. She looked like a woman who had just realized she had built her entire kingdom on sand, and the tide was finally rolling in. I didn't smile, not in the cruel way she would have. I didn't need to. The silence was enough. David sat back in his chair like the wind had been knocked out of him, blinking at me as if I were a stranger. Maybe I was. Maybe the Lena he thought he knew wouldn't have done this, wouldn't have gutted their mother's empire in front of 20 dinner guests with the precision of a surgeon and the calm of a confessor. But he never really knew me. None of them did. Because they never bothered to look beyond the narrative she built. The one where I was bitter, difficult, disposable, They saw the version of me she fed them. Until now. I didn't wait for applause. I didn't need a curtain call. I turned and left the dining room without a single backward glance, letting the sound of whispers and unraveling illusions fill the space behind me. I stepped out into the warm Charleston night, the air thick with the smell of magnolia and overdue justice, and I breathed deep. Not because I was proud. Not because I was triumphant. Because I was free. I didn't do it for the money. I did it because she needed to know I was never the weak one. But here's the question I can't answer. Did I just become her?